the official gavel. It's the most fun thing I do all day. You have to go with me on this one. Good morning. I have gavelled our meeting to order. Good morning to each of you on a morning that everybody's upset it's raining, but as I said to you, it is not snow. So there ought to be a moment of silence to pray and say thank you. It is not snow. But I welcome you to the House Children and Youth Committee. And this morning, the members of the committee and any of the public who are here will have an opportunity to learn more about Penn State University's Network on Child Protection and Well-Being. And as I was saying to someone, we are so delighted, Dr. Knoll, to have you here. I first knew Dr. Knoll as a blurb in the newspaper. I forget where I was, and I'm reading, and I go, oh, that would work. And I cut this out, and I think Meredith, our assistant, I came in and said, Meredith, we've got to find this woman, and this would be good for the committee, because that's a lot of what I do. I find things and I stack them in and either give them to the executive director or my assistant, and away we go. So it took some time to coordinate schedules, but we are particularly glad that you're here. In establishing this Center of Excellence, it is focused, as I understand from my reading, on detection, prevention, and treatment of child abuse. Penn State has gathered some of the foremost experts in the field from across the country, brought them together for this distinct purpose. And we are fortunate to have the lady that I read about with us this morning, Dr. Jenny Knoll, who is Professor of Human Development and Family Studies, is the Director of Research and Education for the network. And Dr. Knoll, you'll be the individual presenting this morning, but I know you brought some important folks with you, and if you would do the introductions, and then you begin. I had hoped, ladies and gentlemen, with your understanding, we will listen to the presentation, jot down your questions, and then we will ask them. Sometimes you know how we are. We ask lots of questions along the way, and somehow we never finish the presentation. So I thought we would do it this way. Everybody
roll call.
Okay with that? All
roll
right.
Call.
Why, I will. And I knew roll call. Thank you. But
they told me to tell you.
I know that. But we will introduce your people first, and then we'll do our business and get started.
Okay, good. Well, with me today are three very important people. First, my co-director, Margaret Gray. She's the Director of Policy and Administration for the network. And then Lucy Johnston-Walsh, MSW, JD. She's the director of the Penn State Dickinson School of Law's Center on Children in the Law, and she's a key partner of the network. And then most importantly to me is my daughter Lydia, 12 years old, on spring break in the rain with her mom doing mom's work. So thank you for having us.
Very good. And we do, as you probably all heard in a stage whisper, we have to take attendance, and we will do that now. And I would gently remind you that this meeting is being recorded, so if you would put your cell phones on, I call it stun, whatever you call it, but we don't want to hear ringing and noise or phone calls. That would be great. But now, attendance, all righty.
Okay. Chairman Watson.
Here.
Representative Bloom.
Here.
Representative Dunbar.
Here.
Representative Greiner.
Here.
Representative Keller.
Here.
Representative Lawrence. Representative Maloney.
Here.
Representative Mao. Representative Oberlander. Representative Rock. Representative Sankey.
Here.
Representative Stevens. Representative Tallman. Representative Toohill.
Here.
Representative Topper.
Here.
Chairman Bishop.
Leave.
Representative Boyle. Representative Brownlee.
Here.
Representative Deasy. Representative Haggerty. Representative Kinsey.
Present.
Representative McCarter.
Here.
Representative Miller.
Here.
Representative Rotzi. And Representative Schreiber.
Okay. All right. This is an informational meeting. As I said, it is being recorded. We are ready to begin. We'll ask questions when our presenter is finished.
Okay.
Dr. Knoll, go right
Great.
ahead.
Thank you. Good morning, Chairman Watson and members of the Committee on Children and Youth. We appreciate your interest in my research and this invitation to meet you and to share information about Penn State's network on child protection and well-being. I will begin with a brief and general overview of the scope of child maltreatment, followed by some examples of my specific research, and finally, a description of the network, its mission, and research initiatives going forward. Child maltreatment. Child maltreatment includes sexual abuse, physical abuse, and child neglect. Is substantiated in 1.2 million children each year in the U.S. Another 800,000 reach significant harm standards for child endangerment. This is about 2 million children, 40 in 1,000, or 1 in 25 children are new victims of child maltreatment each year. 2,400 deaths are attributable to child maltreatment, putting child abuse and neglect on par with pediatric cancers in terms of yearly fatalities. In 2011, Pennsylvania had the lowest child abuse investigation rate in the nation at 8.7 per thousand. Now, don't get me wrong, I know that Pennsylvania is a great place for children, but we know now that definitions of child abuse and of perpetrator were inordinately narrow, and resources for reporting abuse along with supports for its substantiation were limited, scenarios that likely resulted in an underestimate of Pennsylvania child abuse prevalence rates. But recent and significant legislative reform of Pennsylvania's child protection laws will result in several measures that can expand these important definitions and will soon put Pennsylvania in line with most other states in terms of prevalence. In addition, this recent legislation strengthens child abuse investigations through the development and expansion of evidence-based, multidisciplinary investigative teams across the Commonwealth. You should be commended. You should be commended. As a result, Pennsylvania now has a set of definitions and investigative standards comparable with most other states in the U.S. These extensive changes to Child Protective Service laws are an important and critically necessary step in combating child maltreatment. Now, where do we go from here? How do we accommodate the potential influx of new abuse and neglect cases into our system? How do we facilitate high standards for investigative teams in every advocacy center across the Commonwealth? How do we estimate the impact of these changes on the Medicaid system, given that a large portion of affected families will be Medicaid eligible? And how do we pay for increasing demands? Are there approaches to primary and secondary prevention that will save costs later? How can evidence-based treatments be tailored for effectiveness and optimized for efficiency? And how do we stop the cycle of abuse and neglect from persisting across time and across generations? I have been investigating the long-term developmental impact of abuse and neglect for the past 18 years, with a rare and specific focus on sexual abuse. My approach to science is to follow groups of child abuse survivors, along with groups of demographically matched comparisons recruited from the same neighborhoods, over long periods of time through key developmental stages. I conduct this research prospectively, meaning that I don't simply ask what happened, I observe phenomena as they occur and as they unfold. Because this type of research design enables me to make strong inferences about child abuse and how it gives rise to later psychological and physical problems that are of grave public health concern. For example, I have followed a cohort of over 500 adolescent females, ages 14 through 19, in order to track teen pregnancy and motherhood rates. I recruited about half this sample from protective service agencies, and these girls had experienced sexual abuse, physical abuse, or neglect within the past year. The other half was a demographically matched comparison group recruited from a local teen health center. By the end of this NIH-funded study, 20% of the abused and neglected females became teen mothers, a rate of 5 times the national average. I'm working on another NIH-funded study that has been following sexually abused females for 30 years. These women were recruited in the late 80s when they were on average 10 years old, Now they're entering their late 30s and early 40s. Now I want to step back for a second, and I want us to think about sexual abuse for a moment. There are not many childhood conditions that are more stressful than the experience of childhood sexual abuse. Over these many years, I have been saddened but privileged to hear the details of these stories directly from the mouths of hundreds and hundreds of victims. Hearing these stories, as would be the case for anyone, has made me a more caring human being, a better mom, and a concerned citizen. And listening has made me a keen scientist. My heart would race right along with theirs as these girls and women described the many nights they laid awake in terror, waiting for their perpetrator to act, not knowing for certain when it would happen, how long their sleep would be disturbed, or when it might end. Those who could predict the horror described the sound of the key in a door when their perpetrator would return home, perhaps after a night of drinking, angry and ready to take it out on the weak. And years later, to have these same victims describe how later in life they experienced the same racing heart at the smell of a familiar cologne, or of booze on the breath, or at a similar sound of the unlocking of a different door. This kind of stress, unpredictable, yet constant and extreme, the kind that starts early in life when physiological systems are developing and their future organization and function are being established. The kind of stress that never quite goes away, even when the danger subsides. This is the kind of stress, as animal models have shown us, has significant wear and tear on the body, the brain, and on multiple endocrine and neurobiological systems. This wear and tear from stress is starting to permeate my research observations. In our longitudinal cohort of women, we tracked cognitive abilities by conducting memory, reasoning, and vocabulary assessments throughout the years. And we are beginning to see premature cognitive aging and the early signs of cognitive decline, although none of these women have yet reached age 45. These findings are consistent with what we believe to be later life manifestations of early brain maldevelopment and evidence for neurobiological consequences of early and chronic stress. Moreover, a significantly lower number of sexually abused women in this cohort graduated from high school. Overall, they report lower education and occupational attainment, both behavioral and economic manifestations of lower cognitive abilities. We also, importantly, tracked body mass in this cohort throughout development. And by the time the sample reached late adolescence, 42% of the abused females were obese. Not just overweight, but obese according to CDC standards. The comparison group was about 28% obese, which is on line with the national average. We are now prospectively tracking other consequences in this cohort, including diabetes, high blood pressure, heart problems, and risk for various cancers. My work and other similar work has shown that sexual abuse victims also suffer some substance abuse problems later in life, are more likely to be raped in late adolescence and early adulthood, and are more likely to experience domestic violence. A rich body of research has tracked mental health problems associated with child abuse, including depression, post-traumatic stress disorder, suicidality, and other psychiatric conditions. Further, I tracked the premature birth rates of this cohort of sexually abused women and their matched comparisons, finding that 20% of offspring born to abused women were born premature. This is about twice the national average. One of the biggest concerns for practitioners and advocacy providers in this field is the intergenerational transmission of child maltreatment and the impact that abuse has on the next generation. Because we have followed this sample for so long, we have some of the only data on how the abuse experience of the mother confers risk to her offspring. For example, offspring born to abused mothers entered Child Protective Services at 17 times greater the rate than comparison offspring. We have had 4 infant deaths so far in this cohort. 2 died due to prematurity complications. One died after being bored heroin addicted, and one died in a bathtub drowning that was deemed infanticide at the hands of his mother. All 4 of these deaths occurred in the abuse group. Offspring born to abused mothers also scored significantly lower on their own cognitive ability tests, and in a mother-child dyadic relationship observational task, displayed less security in their attachment styles than comparison offspring. Now, there are recent estimates that child abuse and neglect incur lifetime costs of over $124 billion. This is greater than costs associated with all types of childhood cancers, lead exposure, autism, and asthma combined. Some of these documented costs are incurred in the acute phases of child abuse discovery, including hospitalizations and costs to the child welfare, foster care, and criminal justice systems. Some of these costs are estimated long-term costs, including mental health needs, lost wages, and truncated earning potentials. Still, other costs are derived from estimates of intervention, including immediate intervention requirements, long-term therapeutic and pharmacological treatments, and special education needs. But missing from these estimates, however, are the cost of the long-term public health consequences that we were learning about in prospective research like mine. For example, the public health impact of the neurobiological and brain maldevelopment findings, increased teen pregnancy rates, obesity, and other long-term concerns, substance abuse, domestic violence, and premature delivery are not included in these estimates. Hence, it is difficult to reconcile the existing cost estimates with what is known currently about the long-term and intergenerational impact of abuse and neglect. My sense is that the true public health costs are significantly underestimated. What is clear to me and to many of my colleagues is that prevention and treatment of child abuse and neglect are of paramount importance, not only because of the sheer numbers of victims and the terror that victims endure, but because of the potential for its grave and expensive consequences. I'd like to turn now to Penn State's network on child protection and well-being and describe our efforts to combat child abuse and its long-term negative health consequences. The network was formally launched in October 2012, based on the recommendation of the President's Task Force on Child Maltreatment. Its mission is to build a sustainable network of researchers and practitioners who will produce new knowledge, foster the design and evaluation of innovative approaches to the prevention, detection, and treatment of child maltreatment, create interdisciplinary education opportunities and experience for Penn State students, and put the products of these efforts to work in communities throughout Pennsylvania and beyond. We are in the process of hiring at least 12 new faculty members. I was one of the first of those hires, who will advance child maltreatment research across key areas of study, establish multidisciplinary partnerships, and expand the university's internationally recognized expertise in research, education, and engagement that already promotes the health and well-being of children, youth, and families. The network provides an unprecedented opportunity, nothing like this has ever happened in my field, to address important gaps in the field and connect the dots between child maltreatment and a myriad of deleterious outcomes. The ultimate goal is to orient providers and policymakers toward recognizing the prevention and treatment of child maltreatment as worthy of significant public health investment. There are 4 broad areas that the network will address. The first is basic science. Child abuse is a phenomenon that begs for basic science that can shed light on the precise mechanisms that are triggered in the face of early and chronic stress, how to prevent and modulate these extreme reactions, how to treat a compromised stress reactivity system, and how to mitigate later negative health consequences. Several network faculty hires are dedicated to cutting-edge research that will illuminate the biologic substrates of early trauma and abuse in order to promote optimal health for victims. For example, one network faculty member studies the impact of chronic stress on chromosomes, specifically telomeres, which facilitate cell reproduction and have implications ranging from immune functioning to the development of cancer to premature aging. Another faculty member is an international leader in the field of chronic stress and brain maldevelopment, neuroendocrine functioning, and neurocognitive plasticity. Others are working on personalized predictive medicine approaches that will optimize treatment delivery based on pre-treatment endocrine functioning as well as genetic and epigenetic profiles. Still, other basic research will connect the dots between child abuse and the development of obesity and other health conditions. The second area of impact is prevention. Stopping child abuse before it happens is a key focus of the network. Primary prevention research will focus on understanding perpetrator behaviors, raising community awareness, increasing avenues for detection and reporting, and injecting child abuse prevention strategies into existing and already prolific universal home visiting parenting programs. Child abuse is a prime example of how notions of prevention need to be expanded. Secondary prevention programs that specifically target child abuse victims are sorely needed if we are to impact important areas of public health. For example, network research will explore how adding abuse-specific modules will strengthen the efficacy of several existing adolescent prevention efforts, including teen pregnancy, obesity, and substance use programs. Network faculty are also partnering with the inceptors of a targeted prevention program called Safe Care, which has been shown to significantly decrease child welfare recidivism for families who are currently in the system. Our hope is that Pennsylvania will join a growing list of states that has adopted this program, including California, Colorado, Oklahoma, and Georgia. The third area of impact is treatment and translation. The translation of the basic and observational science into avenues for treatments is a vital step in impacting the lives of victims and their families. Through optimization trials, several network faculty members are working toward ways to more effectively deliver evidence-based trauma treatments, ways that will promote tailoring, increase engagements and responsive rates, and reduce costs. Other faculty members are working on novel evidence-based approaches for patients who do not respond to traditional treatments or who are in need of innovative strategies. The development of new treatments that move beyond current trauma treatment foci and focus on health disparities experienced by victims is also a priority. Still, other research will focus on identifying and promoting resilience. Over these many years of observing the lives of victims, scores of truly amazing women have shared with me remarkable stories of triumph. It will be from these stories that we will fashion the next generation of novel intervention strategies. The evidence-based prevention and treatment models that will emanate from the network's impactful translational research will only be as effective as our ability to reach the families most in need. Hence, dissemination and implementation science will be a vital aspect of network faculty activities. Specific focus areas will include breaking down barriers to service, increasing family engagement, enhancing access for rural communities, and promoting education and awareness for community providers. The fourth and critically important area of impact that my co-director Margaret Gray is spearheading is engagement. Aside from the research itself, the network also seeks to impact the lives of victims and their family through a multi-pronged engagement approach. This includes an annual conference series and other dissemination activities that will raise an awareness about the basic and translational research that directly informs the evidence-based programs. This also includes education initiatives that promote awareness about the scope and gravity of child maltreatment, with specific emphasis on engaging students who will comprise the next generation of practitioners and child advocates. Our engagement approach will also inform public policy about the best ways to detect, prevent, and treat child abuse and neglect, and we will work together with policymakers to help implement and sustain legislative and regulatory changes. I am pleased to be part of Penn State's Network on Child Maltreatment and Well-Being. I am also pleased to be a brand-new resident of this progressive state and to see such tangible legislative mobilization for the betterment of abused and neglected children and their families. I am pleased at the strides we have made in collaborating with Bev Macarith and Kathy Utz at the Department of Public Welfare to enhance our ability to engage in this impactful research. I am excited about the prospects of protecting children who are in danger and who are in need, and about the possibilities for these children to live healthy and productive lives. Thank you for your time and attention and for working so hard on behalf of children in the Commonwealth and beyond.
Dr. Knoll, thank you. And honestly, I am very glad that the testimony was here and written down. I've made notes, and some for the future, some for this. I won't rip it apart in front of you, but I think it's very important. Many of you may have questions or want some further clarification to what was said. Do we have folks that... Maloney. All right, Mr. Maloney, you had a question? Go right ahead.
Thank you, Madam Chair. This has been a very, as you well stated, Jenny, that this has been a very difficult and challenging endeavor that we have done in the last, over a year, especially 2 years. Some of us have come with more background and concern to this much sooner than that. And I really appreciate many of the points that you brought out. And this question that I'm going to ask is not really to put you on the spot, but I did notice, our child protection bills are not gender specific. And I noticed that it was mostly about women. I saw one reference to a male that actually wasn't sexual abuse, but I guess my question and concern is our young men too, with respect to that complicated issue also.
Yeah, one of my next steps in my own research is boys. And in fact, one of the things I talked about when I went to Penn State originally for my interview was how boys are neglected in terms of research. Part of this problem has to do with how NIH funds research, and that you have to have very large samples in impactful science to be very competitive in those arenas. And when I have gone and tried to find large samples of boys, I've had a difficult time trying to do that. Those need to be multi-site endeavors. Not all the time do boys get put into the child welfare system in the same kind of numbers that girls do, especially in adolescence. But what I feel, and I feel that the pathways are going to be completely different for boys. Maybe not in terms of the impact of stress, but boys that I have talked to and that I have listened to have completely different experiences of sexual abuse in particular. This is a widely neglected area, and one that I hope, for my own research, to take my research with females and replicate it with boys with a different focus.
Yeah, and appreciate
it's very
that.
Well appreciated.
Yeah, I appreciate that clarification, because to me, I know even in my office, we kind of gather all sorts of news, if you will, and from every piece of information that I receive, especially with young children, it seems to be pretty much 50-50.
Yeah.
So that's kind of why.
The young children.
Yes. So, knowing the prevention and where this starts, to me, that's very significant. So it'll be interesting to me how you'll engage that data or engage the boys in this process. So.
And we can also learn a lot by asking adult victims about their experiences.
Sure.
That will be one way I think we'll learn a lot about perpetrator behavior, how this happens, how it could have been prevented in a lot of these cases. That's another approach that I'm beginning to take.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Madam Chair. I know I'm going to have to slip out for another committee, so thank you for allowing me.
No, that's fine, and that brings up a point for anyone sitting here who hasn't been to a committee meeting in the Capitol, and you see people and you think, as a former teacher, you think, how rude. They look like they're reading, they get up and leave. Sadly, because times are very limited, we end up with 2 or 3 meetings, and if it's a voting meeting, you figure, when can I leave this for the information, but still getting time to vote on a bill that's coming up. So you'll see people in and out, and a lot of them are trying to arrive late to get some of this information. I should also say that for those who could not make the meeting, we will take your information. We always see to it that they get it in an email, so everything is disseminated. Mr. Rossi, you have a question?
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you for coming here and testifying today. I appreciate it. As a victim of sexual abuse myself at the hands of a Catholic priest, I understand, and everything you're hearing is very loud to my ears. A couple of my childhood friends have committed suicide. Many are alcoholics, drug addicts, and are suffering so much right now later in life. So I appreciate what you're doing here. The study that you did, you talked about a lot of abuse in the 80s. How many of those girls that you studied, that their perpetrators have been held accountable, that they have been arrested? And how many have not been able to be prosecuted because of the statute of limitations?
Right. I would say, in this particular cohort, this was all substantiated abuse, so very, very many of the perpetrators were at least collared and prosecuted. That doesn't mean that they all went to jail, but many of them were prosecuted. It's very interesting because when I talk to these women about that process, back in those days, the girls themselves were held at pretty high standards for testimony, and many of them had to tell their testimony over and over again. These days, with multidisciplinary investigative teams now is the standard, children only have to say it once, and they have to say it to a professional, and it's videotaped, and that becomes the evidence. So part of the criminal justice system is being overhauled so that it's not so traumatic on kids having to say it over and over in front of strangers. It's very interesting to me, now that these women are in their 30s and early 40s, some new trauma is cropping up for them, because those perpetrators that did go to jail, guess what? They got 30 years. They're getting out. Some of them have become Facebook friends. Some of them have wanted to have contact with the grandchildren. Some of them now live across the hall from their original victim and their grandchildren. So it's not something that even when there is prosecution and there's justice, that it completely goes away.
Right.
So I'm interested in those processes, but they're still the victims, and with my adolescent cohort in particular, where they see justice hasn't been done, and the guy is still there, or there wasn't quite enough evidence.
Right. Well, you talk about, and I also talk about protecting the next generation. As in the 80s, for myself, I had 2 years past my 18th birthday to come forward and, call out my perpetrator, and that was never going to happen.
Right.
And I have many, I can't tell you how many people are reaching out to me now who have been abused during that time. And as a child, we don't know that. For me to come forward, it was, I was 39 years old, and my second childhood friend committed suicide. And that's when I was able to step forward and say, this has happened to me. So, you talk about protecting the next generation. Does your organization take a position on either eliminating the statute of limitations moving forward, or even the retroactive legislation that myself has introduced that's not moving anywhere in the House?
Okay, so I can't speak for Penn State, but I also have Lucy Johnston-Walsh here, who might be able to give you an opinion that might be a little bit more informed, because this is her area of expertise. Is that okay? Sure. Is that okay? Yep. You want to come right in?
As you all know, we're working on the laws that go along with this, so there's a lot of legislation that's being passed and legislation that's being worked on, and I applaud all of you for the work you've already done, but there's still more to go. And so if your specific question is the statute of limitations, or...
Yeah, I would like to know if you're taking a position on, I think one thing that we could do to protect our future generations right now is pass prospective legislations that would totally eliminate the civil and criminal statutes of limitations. But me personally also feel a need that we also need to do something retroactively because there's a block there of kids, and you're going to see at what happened at Penn State. Victims are reaching out to me from the Jerry Sandusky incident that were before the statute of limitations that have timed out, that they're not going to be able to hold Jerry accountable.
Well, so that's something that you can work on. I mean, it's...
We have been working on this, and the bills are not moving anywhere in the House of Representatives or the Senate. But I would like to know, because we have over 30 children organizations that do support this legislation retroactively and prospectively, and it's not moving. But I would like to know if your organization is going to take a stance on that, eliminating the statute of limitations moving forward, and even looking back retroactively.
I don't think we can take a stand, as academics, but as a researcher, what I can tell you is that there's no statute of limitations on the wear and tear to the body. The long-term health consequences, we're just now beginning to understand in terms of prospective research. This is brand new stuff. The publications that I showed you are very recent and in very high-impact journals because people are interested. Also, community awareness is in a place now where it wasn't in the 80s. We're getting to a place as a community where we can feel okay about speaking out for the first time in history. So these are all things that can be, utilized to help make your argument. As a researcher, I see it very, very clearly.
Well, I just want to make sure that our committee knows that we talk about protecting the next generation. At least we need to eliminate, in my eyes, the civil and criminal statutes moving forward to give our children time. Right now it's 12 years past their 18th birthday, 30 years. That's a little ridiculous. We had a rally up here in the steps, and I had a woman come up and approach me who was 75, who was raped when she was 15, and can remember it as if it happened yesterday. And she's like, "Mark, I know what you're fighting for up here. You're the first person I'm ever telling."
Right.
So it definitely takes people a long time to come forward. I just wish our body would understand it and realize it and do something about
It's
it.
certainly a way to support victims.
Thank you.
Representative Miller, you had a question?
Thank you, and thank the chairwoman for bringing this topic up today, and also for Representative Rossi, who's been fantastic on these issues and brings up many good points about what needs to happen. A couple thoughts when I was listening to your presentation. First, I guess there was two word choices with it that you made, and one of them was, I thought was just kind of funny in my head, just because you were saying offspring so many times.
Yeah.
And I know you didn't mean it in any way with it, but in my mind, I'm like, it almost is like de-emphasizing the kids aspect of it. So I thought about that when what you were talking about. But the second thing was, you said phenomenon, and I was like, plague. And I think phenomenon almost gives me an impression of something impressive, but plague is what I think of more in these regards. And I appreciate, I know Representative Maloney had brought up a question I was going to ask regarding gender issues, and I'm glad about that. But one of the things that I get, that I'm looking for on this is, and I appreciate the information about the long-standing effects and when things come about and how you can measure the damage. But my experience in these issues have been that this is the perpetrators are males, overwhelmingly. And what I'm interested in is, and it's great to know how, I'm sure there's information you could glean from your research that can help on certain aspects of this, but the thing to me is we are not able to address, or we have not been able to find what are we not doing in our society that is creating an environment where these things are happening to such a degree. And obviously, when you think domestic violence, I'm thinking Usually I'm thinking in my head, usually that's a spouse or, a boyfriend-girlfriend type of relationship. But again, most of those issues are male-driven as a perpetrator. So I'm just wondering, is that in your research, or as you continue to have dialogue with this body, I feel like we're not addressing the elephant in the room, and is that something is not working right, where the overwhelming majority of these perpetrators are male. There's something that doesn't work in our society. There's something that we're missing, that is saying, what is making it that there are so many examples of sex abuse against kids, violence against women. And again, not to say it never happens with the perpetrator being a woman, but I think, it's almost like you hear the arguments about profiling in an airport. But the overwhelming profile of these perpetrators are male. And I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on that front, or anything you could share in relation to what we can do on the real preventive side, which is to say that these perpetrators never exist.
Right. You bring up an excellent point, and it's one of the problems that we encounter in our prevention talk, is how do we prevent this before it happens, and how do we identify those people who are most dangerous, who are likely to perpetrate. Some of my colleagues, David Wolf out of Canada at McGill, is doing some work with adolescents, injecting some adolescent prevention programs into the school system in Canada, whereby relationship skills, respect, negotiation skills are taught to adolescents in the developmental context where they're acquiring some of these skills, and when they will go into young adulthood to form these kinds of relationship patterns. So early prevention strategies targeting males in particular, I think, have some promise as a child abuse prevention strategy. It's not always obvious when you talk about what child abuse prevention is when you start in adolescence. One of the biggest predictors of the intergenerational transmission of abuse is the teen pregnancy status of moms, so having kids early. So pregnancy prevention in adolescence as a child abuse prevention strategy is another example of that. But studying perpetrators, studying the patterns, studying what is it about that kind of man, that's an important thing to understand. Another NIH study that I have going on right now is looking at perpetrators of internet-initiated victimization. So I've got 500 teenagers out there with laptop computers, and I'm watching what they're doing. Okay, and I'm watching the kinds of people who start sexual solicitations, and I'm asking them if they've ever met someone offline they first met online. Because we know a little bit about those kind of perpetrators, but not a lot. And we know a little bit about the kind of dangerous situations that kids get themselves into that make those kinds of people have easy access to these kids, and the kind of vulnerabilities that they're displaying. So hardening the target, showing kids that if they put themselves out there as vulnerable, a dangerous person could get at them, that's another strategy. But understanding that perpetrator and what kind of person is likely to be dangerous, that's an area that we need much further study. And you have to understand that these perpetrators are good at what they do. Sexual abuse perpetrators are good at it. They're good at instilling secrecy. They're good at getting people to cover up. That's why it goes on for so long. They make the kids scared to tell. So we have to understand how that happens. We have to empower the community to, when they see this kind of behavior, to question it at least. Not to go on a witch hunt, but to question this.
Yeah, thank you. And just one last comment on it is that, there was a bill not too long ago that talked about highlighting domestic violence issues for teens in schools. And it didn't work. It didn't go anywhere. And part of that, I do feel like that there's opportunities with school-age kids in ways that we obviously have a captive audience in dealing with kids in schools. But of course, we're also balancing out. What I hear a lot from school districts is the more you push in, with programs, with standardized and mandatory testing throughout the whole thing, it's cutting down on everything else. I mean, we're not advancing increasing how long kids are in school, so we're not altering how many days a kid goes to school a year, but we, as a state, continue to cram more and more in, and it makes it difficult. So I did want to say thank you for your information and your response, but that is something I hope we can continue to focus on, because I'm glad you're studying things, and that's a very good tool. But as I said, we have a plague going on, and it's not getting enough attention. There's not enough success in altering that. But thank you. Thank you, Madam Chairwoman.
All right. Thank you very much. Representative Mal has a question, and then Representative Brownlee.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Dr. Knoll. My apologies, I was one of those people in a voting meeting before, so I came in a little bit late, but I do appreciate what you're doing. With your studies, have you come up with a common denominator with perpetrators?
With perpetrators, well, this is going to sound a little bit trite, but if you, following up on your question here, a lot of perpetrators were abused themselves. Okay, you talk about intergenerational transmission of abuse. When you talk about physical abuse, you often see a physically abusive parent who had very harsh parenting when they were a child. You often see perpetrators, some pedophiles, who were also sexually abused when they were very young. If I were to pick up one common denominator, it would be untreated sexual trauma in childhood, and limited resources to treat the kids who come into the child welfare system. So there's very often a direct connection between the perpetrator and their own past. And we also see this in substance abuse treatments. Adult substance abuse treatments are less effective for people who were victims as a child. Depression treatments for women are often less effective for women who were sexually abused. There's home visiting parenting programs that we invest a lot in that are not as effective for parents, one or the other, who was abused in childhood. So there's something about that experience that perpetuates those kinds of experience for the next generation. So I would say untreated trauma is a common denominator.
And in a sense, if you were manhandled and beaten as a child, chances are that's the way you're going to treat your children.
Well, there's a lot of individual variation in that, because a lot of victims don't go on to victimize. But there is a way that we learn about how to parent from our parents. And if those ways are never corrected, or if there are not healthy alternatives offered, there is a likelihood that will happen. In your opinion, is child abuse more prevalent today than in years past, or was it just a dirty secret in years past? Well, I think we've learned from several discussions already today that there have been dirty secrets, and people did not want to speak out years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago. We're more empowered to speak out now. But if you ask me about prevalence rates in the country, there are people that will tell you that those prevalence rates are going down. Substantiation standards are going up. Okay? So it's harder to prosecute. It's harder. But people, I think, are being made aware and coming forward at a rate that's probably greater, maybe because of public awareness. But some people have estimates that if you ask an adult if they were abused as a child, there's a lot greater prevalence rates in retrospective reports than if you look at just the child welfare rates. So it's a difficult thing to reconcile. Are prevalence rates going up or down? I think they're not going anywhere, and they're not going anywhere for a long time. Even if they are going down slightly, let's say, as some of our reports show us in 2010, it's still more kids than a lot of other child problems put together. I mean, I don't even care if it's going down by 200,000 a year. It's still over 1 million kids a year. So I kind of don't even care because I can't point to one thing that's making those rates go up or down. There's no evidence that's showing me that we're doing something as a society to impact those rates. So I don't have a good answer for you because there isn't a good answer. It's still a lot of kids.
without a good answer, certainly then it feels, from my perspective, as though we're shooting arrows in the dark to try and come up with an answer.
Well, I think talking about prevention in a lot of different ways is the way we need to go. So preventing child welfare recidivism is one way to prevent child abuse, because those kids who come into the child welfare system, chances are they're going to be there again and again and again. So what if we had some programs that we injected into the child welfare system where there was some acute treatment, or some education modules, or some health disparities kinds of interventions that were injected into that system? My guess is we'd have a big impact on subsequent child welfare entrances. I think starting in adolescence, as we talked about before, is a way to impact how kids go from into young adulthood, into parenting, with skills that are going to eradicate some of what we'll see in the system. But it's a different way of thinking about prevention. You can't think about this in terms of the cigarette lobby or something. You can't say, stop smoking. This is a different problem. We have to attack it from different avenues in order to make a difference.
Yeah, Representative Rossi just informed me that, it's about 1 in 10 that actually come forward. How do we reach the other 9?
Right.
How do we get them? I think that's one of the goals. And here comes the meatball right down the middle of the plate. I'm going to assume then that you would and your team would fully endorse more CACs with forensic investigators.
Well, you bet. The multi-investigative, the multidisciplinary investigative team model is something that's supported nationally and that has been supported in the state of Pennsylvania. And this is what we had talked about this before. This is one way to reduce the trauma on kids of having to tell their story over and over and over again as well. So they go to a one-stop shop. They get the rape kit right there. They get the photographs of the bruises right there. They're in a room with a professional who knows how not to lead them, who knows the right questions to ask, who knows how to get the right testimony. That's videotaped, and then the child is done with that videotape, with that testimony. So those are something that is highly supported, of course.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Thank you, Madam Chair, for letting me and go pretty deep there. Thank you.
We need the resources,
I agree.
That's a different question, right?
Sure.
That's a different one.
We'll figure that part out.
Well, I'll help you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Representative Brownlee.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Good morning. In your prevention section of your remarks, you talk about a specific program, the Safe Care program,
Right.
that's been adopted in some of the other states. Can you give us information on that program?
Right.
And how it was implemented? Was it a legislative measure? Was it administrative?
Right.
Can you explain that to us?
Yeah, right. I'm not going to be able to satisfy you, but I can give you some really good references and point you in the right direction. But let me describe the program for you and how it's unique. How's that? Safe Care is a program for families when they come into the child welfare system. So for whatever reason, really, but it's very much focused on neglect recidivism. So it's parenting skills. It's a short program. It's pretty inexpensive. It has a cost-benefit ratio that's very impressive when you put it against some other home visiting programs. But it's a program that really has advocacy tied to it, so meeting the family's needs. How can they structure their home environment to be more enriching and nourishing? And then some supports for families in terms of social work support, advocacy, and then mental health service referrals. So it's a short program that is injected right into the child welfare system. And I think, as a prevention-minded person, that is a very good way to go about it. Because what other condition do you know about where everyone is a mandated reporter? Teachers, coaches, administrators, therapists, we're all looking out for kids now. We're all very much aware of when we are a mandated reporter. Those kids get referred to Child Protective Services. Those are the highest risk kids, in my opinion, in our society. And we have a system by which to identify them. Why not invest in that, in providing the programs that those parents need to go further in life in promoting the health and well-being of their kids? So I can get you a lot more information on that program and put you in touch with John Lutzker and Mark Chafin, who are the people who are championing this in Oklahoma and Georgia. And they can give you the details on how exactly they were able to implement those programs. But it's basically through the child welfare system. It's basically through like the Department of Public Welfare or Jobs and Family Services. So it's basically through those centers and those agencies that are contracting with each of their advocacy centers to have this program embedded.
Thank you, Madam Chair. If you could get that information to the chair lady.
Yes.
I'm
Great.
sure she'll. Thank you.
Thank you for the question. Representative Keller?
Thank you, Dr. Knoll, and thank you, Madam Chair. I just have a question trying to understand everything in the accounts of, or the numbers of what are here in the paper, just to put it in perspective. You mentioned child abuse investigation rate, and then above that it's mentioned child maltreatment, including sexual abuse, physical abuse, child neglect, and then it goes on to say is substantiated.
Right.
Are child maltreatment and child abuse interchangeable?
In what I'm saying, they are.
Okay.
I don't always like to say child maltreatment all the time because I think that it dumbs it down a little bit. Like you don't get abuse in there, but child maltreatment is when we talk about national prevalence rates. That's the vernacular that's used, and neglect, sexual abuse, and physical abuse are sort of put into that one category. But I like to split it out a little bit.
Okay. Like I said, I'm just coming from the arena here in state government. Everything has to have a definition, and I'm just trying to make sure
Right.
that I understand,
Right.
you know, in the proper context. Thank you.
Right.
All right, any other questions? Oops. Yes, go right ahead.
I'm sorry, real quick with it. Your work is just with kids and child welfare. Am I right with that?
My work is with victims who have had substantiated maltreatment, and that's because when I try to publish in impactful journals, when I try to get NIH funding, I'm held to a gold standard of what child abuse is. And to rely on substantiated cases, that's how I get where I get.
Okay.
I feel like it underestimates both what is happening in reality of those cases that don't come to awareness of the authorities. Okay, and I also think that the pathways are going to be different for those kids where abuse is never discovered or never reported.
Yeah, and I guess that was my concern or my question with it, because in some ways you can argue either way in relation to once a kid gets into child welfare, you have the possibility of, like you mentioned, so much support that can come, but of course you have a massive funding problem.
Right.
And so many of these kids are coming into situations in child welfare where they need to create a total, I'll say home makeover, but the reality of the situation is it goes much deeper, you know, and there's no easy answer, but funding obviously does limit what a lot of ways we can help those kids. I guess the other question I was going to ask you was in relation to, it seems like if your data's right or your data's, in my opinion, I found that, of course, victimization can happen no matter where you are in the socioeconomic ladder. But it would seem that your data is saying that if you are a victim, you're more likely to be lower on that ladder because you were a victim. Am I understanding that right?
Yeah, and sexual abuse is very interesting because sexual abuse in particular happens at all socioeconomic strata. It doesn't always get reported at every socioeconomic strata, but it occurs, it takes this idea that adversity only happens in poverty and throws it on its ear.
Well,
Okay.
that's what I was trying to think.
Yeah.
It's not so much that I guess you're very much against the proposition that, or somebody's idea to saying that if you're poor, you are more likely to abuse. It's just that you were abused, you're more likely to be poor.
I think that what I'm seeing in my longitudinal work is that if you're abused, you're in several pathways. One pathway is you become a teen, earlier mom. That's not as good for your economic health over the long run. There's substance abuse problems. There's persisting PTSD. There's lots of things that sort of get in the way of being as productive as you might be without that experience. And we see that manifesting in lower overall education attainment and occupational attainment. I'm seeing many of these women now, 30 years later, who are living with mom still, where the family unit is still in one household. A lot of them on public dependence. A lot of them coming together on disability with a brother who's on disability and with a mom who's on disability, sort of perpetuating that scenario. But half of them, maybe 30%, are doing just fine, right? Like, have made it out of that. Have incredible stories of resilience that I think we can learn from. Is what's different about that story than the story that I just put to you.
Yeah, and I know Madam Chairwoman's been giving me a lot of flexibility. The last thing I just as a comment, when I'm interested too, the thought that you got to me was that if you are finding that the damage done to people who are abused can last a lifetime in a quantitative sense, and you're able to come up with those things, it does make one wonder whether you're talking criminally or civilly, that it would seem that damages would extend far beyond what the current criminal code would allow. So it's not so much that somebody may go to jail. I know you referenced 30 years. A lot of them do not go for 30 years.
Right, a lot of
I got what you're saying. So you go to jail for 30 years, you get a fine up to $10,000, whatever could be the deal. But often, like if you're in a situation, a work-related issue or something like that, you have a hand or arm that is impaired for life. Those calculations are brought into damage awards, and I wonder if what one can lead to is that as your evidence becomes more prevalent or more discussed, and I guess part of the mainstream of how those things operate, that would not the argument be that if those if that is the ramifications of what occurred, that those should be considered as lifetime impairments. And should be calculated in the sense that more support should come from the perpetrators upon their release and everything else that they may have available to make that person quote-unquote whole. Thanks for the courtesy.
No problem. And I would agree, certainly Representative Miller, I think you were heading in a direction that I was. I'm very excited about. I know this is a new venture for Penn State, or I'll call it a harnessing of, it's like looking and saying, we have these riches, we now need to reorganize and put them in a new way to do some new things. So with bringing on staff and doing that, that's what you're doing. I really think, Representative Miller, that you've hit on the fact through some really awful and ugly and horrific, and I don't know all the words to say, things that have occurred and now part of the public consciousness. There are good things that will come, some of which I think is a change in attitude, in understanding, in maybe a feeling that someone who's been abused 30 years ago will tell the story, or as Representative Rossi said, an elderly person who says, this happened to me and I still remember and can tell you, but spent a lifetime saying nothing. And from that, and the research that you would do for those who want evidence-based research to make decisions, we will start to have that, which previously, I think a lot of what we have had, it still tears at your heart, but has been anecdotal.
Right.
And so for many people, they don't really, or if it's not in their immediate frame of reference, it is indeed your anecdote but not mine. So I applaud what is happening both at Penn State and what you are doing and putting together, because I think you can help us and provide us with that. I thank you so much for being here. I will leave you. I waited till the end, but I have to get my plug in. I am a great believer, I guess when Representative Mao said, I don't shoot arrows anyway, so I can't shoot them in the dark or in the light. But I've decided, I'm a firm believer after this job in the fact that the key is the prevention. The key is getting to families and giving them enough support. And maybe it doesn't mean money, it means the rest of us who just kind of get involved with somebody in your neighborhood or that you know or in an extended family, but that we start to do that where we protect children. It is part of just the fabric of this country. It is the fabric of all the local communities, as diverse as they are. And we've gotten away from that. There are past generations still alive who would tell you that, yes, when they were children, they knew that the lady down the street would call your mother if you did something, or you just knew that, no matter what your neighborhood was, whether it was rural or it was inner city or whatever, you knew that the adults, it was, I grew up and I thought it was us versus them, the kids and whatever. But you better be straight, because these people will say something. And we've gotten away from a lot of that. If some of your research, as you talked about the prevention and the treatment, if it goes in that direction, I think from my perspective, I'm looking at like public service announcements. I'm looking at things just to keep the public consciousness engaged in the issue and saying, well, I want to help. Well, what do I do? Well, no, of course I don't want that, but what can I do? And if some of your research goes in that direction, at least for myself, and because I'm the chairman, I get to speak for the committee. I'm going to say for all of us, we would be very much interested in that. I think that's important, that we keep the public consciousness and awareness engaged.
Right.
And we give them some tools, basic tools that they might be, that makes it better for children too. And that opens up what we were saying, the dialogue for all those people who have suffered and grown up with the suffering. Some who've been wonderful and resilient, learned to live with the suffering, but we give them a feeling that they could come forward, a feeling they could talk to somebody. I don't know if they'll get all the closure, what are the words they use, retribution, whatever that they want, in some of the ways we want, but at least we give them a different atmosphere. And my thing is, maybe they grow strength or get some kind of positive feeling from seeing that it's not going to continue.
Right.
That things have changed.
Right.
That's my goal. So if you are in that area, I'll give you my cell number. Call me.
Fantastic.
All
Yes,
right.
it has to be a priority.
We very much thank you for the work that you are doing. We very much thank you for coming down from Penn State. We look forward to having, I guess, a kind of a partnership, a dialogue with you, because we are indeed the Children and Youth Committee, and we are about protecting the children of Pennsylvania, but more importantly, making their lives better so that they grow up into healthy adults, and as I say, and take care of me in my old age, but very seriously, have that kind of an atmosphere. Pennsylvania is to be about families, and it's to be about a good place to live and to work, and we always say, and to raise a family. We want to improve that atmosphere and make it the best that it can be. Thank you very much.
Thank you for listening.
All right, with that, I get to bang the gavel once more, and the meeting is agended. Thank you. It's over.